Hey guys, tonight we drift into a world where time itself flickers, not on a phone screen or a glowing microwave panel, but on the slow, steady burn of a candle's flame. Picture this. You're seated in a stone chamber, the air cool and damp, the silence broken only by faint rustles of robes and the scratch of quills. A single candle sputters, its wax dripping like sand through an hourglass, each line carved into its side marking another fraction of your life sliding away. You probably won't survive this kind of monastic routine. Trust me, you'd be asleep long before the midnight bell finished tolling. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The candle flares up in your mind's eye, the wick twisting, alive with its tiny golden tongue of flame. You lean closer, and suddenly you realize this was more than decoration. It was a machine, a humble yet ingenious invention that monks relied on for centuries to structure their world. Think of your smartphone alarm clock, except without the smug little snooze button. Instead, the monks had wax, fire, and patience. You trudge along through the cloisters, feet echoing against flagstones worn smooth by centuries of sandals. Every corner has shadows lurking, yet one little light, perhaps a stubby candle half-burned, glows against the dark. Imagine a dozen monks bowing in unison, their prayers harmonizing with the gentle hiss of dripping wax. In a time when clocks were scarce and mostly theoretical, candles stepped in as both illumination and timekeeper. Here's your first mainstream historical fact. The earliest clear mention of candle clocks appears in 10th century China, where thin candles marked with lines would burn evenly, offering a predictable way to measure the hours. Later, this idea spread, or maybe popped up independently, in medieval Europe's monasteries, where monks adapted it to their rigid schedules of prayer. Historians still argue whether the European monks actually borrowed from Eastern traditions or stumbled into the same discovery on their own, like kids inventing TikTok dances without ever seeing the original. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some monasteries experimented with candles that had embedded weights. As the wax melted, the weights dropped into a metal pan, producing a clang loud enough to wake even the groggiest brother from his nap. Imagine a medieval alarm clock that doubles as a fire hazard. Practical, slightly terrifying, and oddly brilliant. The reality you feel here is this: monks needed precision. The rule of Saint Benedict demanded prayers at very specific times: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Without a reliable timekeeper, the rhythm of the monastery would collapse. A candle, once carefully measured and marked, gave them something the night sky couldn't always provide on cloudy evenings. You pause, picture your own life without glowing wristwatches, phones, or blinking microwave digits. You'd glance at the sun, yes, but at night, you'd need to guess. You'd measure time in candles, the way you now measure a Netflix binge in just one more episode. Your mind wanders to the flame itself. The monks saw not just function but metaphor in the burning. A candle melts as a human life does, steady, inevitable, consumed by its own light. You can almost hear a medieval preacher using it in a sermon. As the wax declines, so does man's time upon this earth. Darkly poetic, sure, but also a reminder not to waste your hours scrolling through doom posts. The flickering flame also creates a hypnotic pull. You imagine yourself staring at it, letting your thoughts dissolve into its soft glow. The candle clock didn't just measure time, it offered a kind of psychological anchor. You could see time disappearing in real time. That might sound stressful, but in a cloister where every hour had purpose, it was oddly comforting. Of course, nothing about medieval life was perfectly consistent. Even here, in this stone-walled hall, drafts might sneak through cracks and tilt the flame, making it burn unevenly. One candle's hour might be shorter or longer, depending on how the wax was mixed. Still, monks weren't expecting millisecond accuracy. They just needed a rhythm reliable enough to structure devotion. You shuffle deeper down the corridor, thinking about how you measure time now. Push notifications, synchronized servers, atomic clocks, satellites in orbit. Then you picture a monk hunched over a candle stub, scratching lines into the side with a knife, praying it'll last till dawn. The contrast is absurd, and yet, isn't there something calming about their slower, gentler approach? Now comes the historian's open debate. Some argue that candle clocks weren't all that common, pointing to spotty evidence and suggesting that water clocks, or simply listening for roosters, may have been just as practical. Others counter that the written records we do have, like notes in monastic chronicles, show candles were crucial in keeping vigil through long nights. The truth, you'll never pin it down precisely, which is fitting when you're talking about slippery things like time itself. You press your palm against the cold wall, imagining centuries of monks doing the same. The candle in your mind burns lower, wax pooling at its base. You realize that by the time it's gone, so is the hour. And in this soft, flickering measure, you feel something strangely comforting. A reminder that time can be tangible, visible, even beautiful, when seen through a flame. You shuffle forward in your candlelit imagination, still clutching that tiny flame as though it were the only clock you owned. But before you get too attached to the wax, you've got to remember, monks weren't the first humans desperate to wrangle the hours. Long before your little robed friends were carving notches into candles, whole civilizations had already been trying to cage time with sunlight, water, and stars. You can almost picture yourself stumbling across an ancient desert, squinting at a sundial while muttering, "So this is basically a giant outdoor wristwatch without the band." Sundials were the OGs of timekeeping. A stick planted upright in the dirt could transform into a tool that whispered the hour by casting its shadow. Mainstream fact: the ancient Egyptians had sundials as early as 1500 BCE. They'd divide the daylight into 12 sections. Never mind that the hours stretched longer in summer and shrank in winter. Consistency was overrated when you were mostly worried about whether the Nile would flood and if your beer supply was steady. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some ancient sundials were so tiny they were portable, like pocket watches for Bronze Age hipsters. Imagine some guy in linen robes whipping one out to impress friends at a feast. "Don't worry, I know exactly when the sun will dip. Look, I brought my sundial on a string." Not as smooth as flashing a Rolex, but give him credit. You step back into the monastic corridor for a moment, the candle flickering in your hand. Then suddenly you're whisked eastward to China. There, long before monks in Europe, scholars were filling bronze bowls with water to track dripping hours. Water clocks, clepsydras, if you want to sound smart, measured time by how evenly liquid trickled from one container to another. The sound of dripping, steady and almost musical, kept judges honest, astronomers precise, and guards awake through the night. Historians still argue whether Europe's fascination with water clocks flowed indirectly from China, or whether different cultures kept inventing similar tools, like parallel playlists of human ingenuity. You kneel beside one of these ancient bowls, listening to the rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. It's both soothing and a little maddening, the way waiting for a text reply can feel timeless until you hear that ping. And yes, just like modern apps glitch, water clocks weren't perfect either. Water evaporated faster in summer, froze in winter, and every bug unlucky enough to take a swim became part of the timing problem. Then there were the stars, the oldest timekeepers of them all. Imagine yourself lying flat on some grassland, staring at Orion crawling across the night sky. Shepherds, sailors, and city dwellers alike all used constellations as giant cosmic wristwatches. Mainstream fact: the Babylonians around 1000 BCE already had detailed star charts predicting heavenly movements with shocking accuracy. For them, stars weren't just sparkly dots. They were celestial gears turning the great clock of the universe. And now your quirky fringe tidbit. In some parts of Polynesia, navigators claim to measure time on long voyages, not only by watching stars rise and set, but by feeling the rhythm of ocean swells against their canoes. Imagine that, an entire clock in your body, rocking along with the sea. Not something you'd find in a monastery, but hey, monks and sailors both needed ways to track hours when the sun was nowhere to be seen. Back in your mental monastery, you picture a young novice hearing stories of all these ancient tricks. Maybe he learns about water clocks through a dusty manuscript, or hears whispers of stargazers from a traveling pilgrim. But in his cloister, none of those seem practical. A sundial doesn't help when clouds roll in, a water clock spills if you bump the table, and stars aren't visible in thick fog. What he has instead is a stub of wax that burns whether the night is clear or stormy. Historians still argue whether monks truly knew about every earlier device. Some claim medieval monasteries were knowledge vaults, stuffed with texts describing Greek clepsydras and Arabic astrolabes. Others think these cloistered men were reinventing the wheel, fumbling toward candle clocks without ever realizing how many cultures had already hacked time. You can almost hear two scholars bickering in a library today. Of course they knew. No, they didn't, while the candle beside them burns on, oblivious. The thing is, those earlier timekeepers had one major flaw for monks. They were either too dependent on the environment, too fragile, or too expensive to maintain. Candles, humble as they were, doubled as light sources anyway. Why not make the flame earn overtime pay? You exhale slowly, imagining the weight of centuries pressing down. The candle in your hand flickers as though nodding, reminding you that time has always been slippery, always shifting, always demanding we invent new ways to track its passage. And while sundials, water clocks, and stars still dazzled with their beauty, none of them carried the same intimacy you'd soon find in wax. With a candle, you could hold time right there in your palm, warm and fragile, burning away one measured inch at a time. You're still carrying that flame in your imagination, the wick dancing like a tiny heartbeat in the dark. The monastery you wander into now is not decorated with golden chandeliers or polished marble. It's cold, it's gray, and it smells faintly of damp stone mixed with beeswax. Your sandals scrape across the flagstones, and the walls rise around you like cliffs, shutting out the outside world. Here, in this hush of cloisters, light isn't decoration, it's survival. Mainstream fact: most medieval monasteries were built with thick stone walls and narrow slit windows, designed less for comfort and more for defense, insulation, and seclusion. Those arrow-slit windows let in a hint of daylight at best. By sunset, the interior turned into a cavern of shadows where monks stumbled unless they carried a candle. Without steady illumination, copying manuscripts, praying in chapels, or even walking through corridors became treacherous. You pause and feel the cool air hugging your skin. Every breath you take hangs visible for a moment, like mist. Imagine trying to read in this half-dark, your eyes straining over handwritten texts by the faintest flame. You'd have a headache before you reached the word Amen. Monks, though, adapted. They didn't need blazing light. They needed enough to keep the rhythm of their day, to trace the lines of their prayers, and to make sure Brother Thomas didn't accidentally bump into the abbot in the hallway. Now for your quirky tidbit. In some abbeys, monks actually used lantern monks as a kind of human flashlight. One brother's job was to walk ahead carrying the flame, guiding others like an Uber driver with medieval surge pricing. Except the payment was patience and obedience, not coins. It's both charming and slightly ridiculous. Imagine being told, "Brother, your vocation tonight is to stand there with the candle so the rest of us don't trip." But for the larger rhythm of life, light meant much more than not tripping on stairs. Without artificial illumination, the human body follows the natural day. Awake with sunrise, asleep by sundown. Monastic schedules, however, were not that forgiving. Prayers had to be recited at precise hours, including the dreaded vigils, which took place deep in the middle of the night. You imagine yourself yanked from warm blankets at 2 a.m., trudging barefoot across icy floors to stand in the chapel. Without candles, the entire community would look like a lineup of sleepy ghosts muttering into the darkness. Historians still argue whether monasteries were truly as dark as we imagine, or whether torches, oil lamps, and hearths provided more light than the drama-soaked stories suggest. Some believe that chroniclers exaggerated the gloom to heighten the holiness of monks suffering in shadow, while others insist that yes, the cloisters were as dim as a cave at midnight. The candle, in either case, becomes not just a tool but a symbol of endurance, the tiny defiance against endless dark. Picture yourself walking into the scriptorium, where monks copy texts with aching precision. The room smells of ink, parchment, and singed wick. A line of candles flickers along the desks, their wax dripping steadily as words flow onto vellum. Each monk knows that when the candle burns to a certain point, an hour has passed. Time is not a buzzing second hand on a wall clock. It's the gradual shortening of flame. The candle itself whispers the day's passage as ink stains fingers black. Think about your own routines, coffee breaks, alarms, notifications. Now swap them for wax. Your latte is gone. That's 15 minutes. Your candle notch melts down. That's the next prayer bell. Suddenly, you can feel how the monks weren't just using candles as backup flashlights. They were entwining their entire existence with these little sticks of time. And here's another charming oddity. Beeswax candles were so valuable that some monasteries reserved them only for the church and important ceremonies. For everyday tasks, monks often had to settle for smoky tallow candles made from animal fat. Those stank like a greasy kitchen and dripped unevenly, making them terrible timekeepers. Still, you'd rather have a smelly, sputtering flame than walk into Brother Matthew's elbow in pitch black. The deeper you walk into the monastery halls, the more you notice how silence amplifies everything. The crackle of a candle wick is loud here. The drip of wax landing on wood echoes like a ticking clock. You realize that monks didn't just see time. They heard it, smelled it, and sometimes burned their fingers on it. Time was sensory, physical, unavoidable. Your eyes drift to a tall candle in the chapel, steady and solemn. Its wax melts just enough to signal when vigils should shift into lauds. To the monks, the candle is more than convenience. It's a partner in devotion, a silent bell glowing with holy purpose. And you, caught in this quiet rhythm, realize how profoundly fragile yet grounding it feels to let flame, not steel gears or atomic pulses, be the keeper of your hours. You step further into the stone labyrinth of this monastery, candles still flickering in your mind's hand, and the sound of chanting drifts toward you like waves rolling through the cloisters. The voices are steady, measured, and layered, each monk locked into a rhythm older than the walls themselves. That rhythm, you realize, is no accident. It's not a sing when you feel like it situation. It's a precise framework laid down centuries earlier by one man, Saint Benedict. Mainstream fact. In the 6th century, Benedict of Nursia wrote his Rule of Saint Benedict, a guidebook for monastic living that shaped European monasticism for over a millennium. It wasn't just about being pious, it was about order. Every hour of the day had its place, from work in the fields to study in the scriptorium, and especially prayer. Benedict divided the day into 8 distinct hours of prayer, and yes, some of them fell in the middle of the night, because apparently holiness doesn't respect your need for REM sleep. You imagine yourself as a young novice hearing this for the first time. Brother, you'll rise before dawn, you'll pray at sunrise, you'll pray at mid-morning, midday, mid-afternoon, sunset, bedtime, and oh yes, again in the middle of the night. You probably won't survive this, not without at least 3 cappuccinos and a therapist. But for monks, this rhythm wasn't punishment. It was the heartbeat of their world. Now the quirky tidbit. Some monasteries got so enthusiastic about the rule that they enforced it with literal bells strapped to the abbot. Picture it, the abbot walking around like a human alarm clock, jingling his way through the corridors to drag half-asleep brothers out of bed. Not exactly the dignified silence you'd expect, but definitely effective. The candle comes back into play here. Imagine the problem. You need to wake for vigils around 2 or 3 in the morning. It's pitch black. There's no sunrise to guide you, no rooster conveniently crowing on schedule. You can't rely on guessing. So, you turn to a candle. By carving lines into its wax and lighting it at bedtime, you can measure when the flame burns down to a notch. That's your cue. Time to stumble into the chapel for prayers. The candle becomes both your nightlight and your spiritual alarm clock. Historians still argue whether Benedict himself envisioned candle clocks, or whether this adaptation came later as monks realized just how uncooperative the night can be. Some scholars suggest that early monasteries relied more on the stars and water clocks, while others insist that candle clocks were the perfect fit for Benedict's rigid structure. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Like most things in history, it was less a single invention and more a messy patchwork of practices. You shuffle into the chapel now, where rows of monks bow and chant. The only light comes from tall candles flickering on the altar, their shadows stretching like dark ribs along the walls. You can almost smell the beeswax melting, thick and sweet. Each flame is more than fire, it's a marker of obedience. When one burns halfway down, it's time to change the pace of prayer. When another sputters near its end, the service concludes. The rule's rhythm was relentless, but it also offered stability. In a world where war, famine, and plague lurked outside monastery walls, the schedule inside never wavered. Time was domesticated, tamed by candles and bells. You may think of your own day as structured by deadlines, alarms, and meetings, but here it's sculpted by flame, its gentle glow ruling with more authority than a boss's email. And there's something hypnotic about that thought. You imagine yourself drifting into their rhythm, waking at the candle's cue, chanting until your voice blends with the others, eating at the same moments every day, sleeping when told. Your individuality dissolves, replaced by the collective heartbeat of the monastery. Time doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the rule, and the rule belongs to the flame. You can hear it in the chant now, the voices layered like clock gears turning. You picture the abbot glancing at a half-burned candle, nodding slightly, and signaling the next part of the liturgy. No need for gears or dials. The flame is enough. And you, caught in the soft glow, begin to understand how a life so tightly bound to measured time could feel less like imprisonment and more like freedom. After all, when every hour is decided, you're freed from indecision. You don't ask, "What should I do now?" The candle already answers. The wax drips lower, and with it, your awareness of just how strange and beautiful it is to live in a world where time is not numbers flashing on a screen, but fire melting in silence. You're still standing in the glow of that monastic chapel, the chant humming in your ears like bees circling their hive, when you notice something simple yet profound. Every one of those candles is handmade. No factory molds, no supermarket multipacks, just monks, wax, and a lot of trial and error. If you think your first attempts at baking banana bread looked tragic, wait until you picture a medieval novice trying to pour hot wax into a crooked mold, spilling half of it onto the stone floor. Mainstream fact: by the early Middle Ages, European candles were usually made from tallow, animal fat, or if you were lucky and wealthy, beeswax. Tallow candles smoked, smelled like a wet sheepdog, and burned unevenly, while beeswax burned cleanly and steadily, perfect for both prayer and timekeeping. But beeswax was expensive, sometimes as valuable as coin. Monasteries often had their own beehives, and caring for them became part of the rhythm of sacred labor. A jar of honey sweetened the monk's bread, while the wax built his clocks. Now for your quirky tidbit. Some records suggest that when beeswax was scarce, monks experimented with bizarre substitutes. Butter, for instance. Yes, actual butter, rolled into crude sticks stuffed with a wick. Imagine lighting up your pantry like it's a giant croissant. The problem? Butter candles melted into gooey puddles almost instantly, and the smell turned the chapel into a dairy aisle. It was proof that necessity makes people creative, even if the results are less than heavenly. You kneel in the scriptorium now, watching a monk scratch a notch into a thick candle. He's muttering under his breath, adjusting the spacing, clearly irritated that yesterday's candle burned faster than expected. That's the challenge of early experiments. Wax quality varied, wicks were inconsistent, and airflow changed everything. Monks became amateur scientists without realizing it, testing wick thickness, adjusting molds, noting how quickly one candle burned compared to another. You're witnessing a centuries-long research project, with every stub of wax a data point. Historians still argue whether these early experiments were systematic, with monks carefully recording their results, or whether it was all improvisation, each brother solving problems as they arose. Some argue monasteries were proto-laboratories, places where observation and record-keeping were baked into their culture. Others suggest that the waxwork was too mundane to leave behind neat documentation, which explains why so much of it survives only in fragments and passing mentions. Either way, you can feel the trial-and-error energy buzzing in the air, like a medieval science fair without ribbons. You trail behind another monk as he carries fresh candles into the chapel. They're thick, heavy, and fragrant with beeswax. He places them on the altar with reverence, not just because they'll light the prayers, but because they embody hours of labor, tending bees, harvesting honeycombs, melting wax, pouring, cooling, trimming. Each candle is both clock and devotion, a physical link between the sweat of daily work and the ethereal rhythm of prayer. You think about your own modern gadgets, the mass-produced LED clocks, the phone alarms you set with a swipe. Convenient, yes, but impersonal. These monks, in contrast, touched every stage of their timekeeping device. The very wax that dripped onto the stone was born from their hives, their fields, their hands. Time itself smelled faintly of honey. The candle flame you're staring at wavers, and for a moment you imagine it whispering secrets. How many hours it can last, how many prayers it will guide, how many generations will stare at similar flames. You can see why monks became fascinated not only with the utility of candles, but also with their mystery. A single stick of wax, burning predictably enough to structure a life. What could feel more miraculous in a dark and unpredictable world? And as the wick crackles softly, you realize this wasn't just about keeping track of hours. It was about control. In a society ruled by unpredictable weather, crop failures, and wars, having a candle that reliably measured your night gave you something solid to cling to. The monks weren't just experimenting with wax. They were experimenting with certainty itself. The scent of beeswax still lingers in your mind, but now you're drawn to something more deliberate. Those strange little scratches carved into the side of the candles. You walk closer, squinting at the wax, and see that each candle is more than a lump of fuel. It's a tool carefully marked to measure the passage of time. Suddenly, you realize you're staring at one of history's earliest analog countdown timers. Mainstream fact: some of the earliest descriptions of candle clocks in medieval Europe mention candles inscribed with evenly spaced lines. As the wax melted down past each mark, monks knew an interval of time had passed. Simple, right? But here's the catch: wax doesn't always burn evenly. Still, if the candle was made well enough, those notches offered a practical way to divide a long night into manageable slices. Picture yourself holding such a candle. Its surface isn't smooth, it's ridged with shallow grooves. A monk lights it at bedtime, and as each groove disappears into molten wax, he knows another unit of time has slipped by. It's not digital precision, but it's better than guesswork. Each line is like a little deadline, glowing brighter the closer it creeps. Now for your quirky tidbit. Some ingenious monks took this idea further and embedded little metal pins at certain levels inside the wax. When the flame melted down to a pin, it would fall into a metal dish with a clang. Voila, an audible alarm. It's basically the medieval equivalent of setting your phone to loud, because you know you'll sleep through vibrate. Imagine being jarred awake not by a ringtone, but by a tiny plink, echoing in the chapel at 2 in the morning. You drift into the scriptorium again. Rows of monks are hunched over parchment, quills scratching like insects in the silence. A line of marked candles flickers along the benches, each one telling its own story of time. One candle may burn steadily, another unevenly, but the marks give a rhythm to their work. Each scribe glances at the wax, then back to his words, syncing his hand with the flame. The room becomes a living metronome, its tempo kept by fire. Historians still argue whether such candles were widespread across Europe or limited to particular monasteries with better resources. Some believe they were fairly common, given the sheer practicality, while others point out the scarcity of surviving written evidence, suggesting they might have been more of a niche experiment. The debate continues like the flame itself, wavering, but never going out entirely. The deeper you imagine yourself here, the more the candle feels alive. The flame leaps higher with a draft, sinks low when the wax pools too quickly, flickers like a nervous heartbeat when the air shifts. You realize timekeeping wasn't just passive observation, it required watchfulness. A distracted monk could miss his mark, just as you might miss your bus because you were too busy scrolling. And then there's the ritual element. Lighting a marked candle before sleep isn't just practical, it's intentional. It's like setting an intention stone on your desk or programming your calendar for the week. The act itself grounds you. This is how long I will rest. This is when I will rise. The flame becomes a contract between your body and your schedule. You chuckle softly at the thought of monks effectively inventing the sleep timer long before Netflix ever asked. Are you still watching? Their candle didn't pause the show. It ended it with a puddle of wax and a chapel bell. The air grows warmer as you imagine the wax dripping, notch by notch. Each drop is a tiny heartbeat of the monastery's rhythm. And as you watch those scratches fade, you sense how beautifully fragile this system was. Wax melting, flame consuming, monks trusting their lives to something that could sputter out with a single gust of wind. And yet, in that fragility lies something strangely comforting. A reminder that time is not cold numbers on a glowing screen, but a warm, flickering presence, always moving, always melting away. The candle in your hand burns lower now, and as it does, you drift into the dead of night. The monastery lies hushed, cloisters empty, stone walls holding in the kind of silence you only notice when every other sound has died. And then there it is. A bell tolls softly in the darkness, its echoes slipping through the corridors. It's time for the monk's midnight vigil. You shiver, realizing that in this world, sleep is never truly uninterrupted. Mainstream fact. Monks divided their day into 8 canonical hours of prayer, and one of the most demanding was the nocturnal vigil, also called matins. Around midnight or later, sometimes closer to 2 a.m., the bell would summon the community out of their hard straw beds into the chapel. For them, waking in darkness was an act of discipline and devotion, a way of reminding themselves that faith was not about comfort. You picture it vividly. The brothers trudging in a slow line, each carrying a candle, their flames bobbing like tiny lantern fish in a sea of shadow. They gather in the chapel, where taller candles mark the altar, and chant fills the cavernous space. The sound is low, steady, and slightly eerie, as though the night itself were humming. The candles aren't just keeping time, they're warding off the darkness, keeping the monks tethered to a sense of place and rhythm when the rest of the world sleeps. Now for your quirky tidbit. In some monasteries, the night prayers were so taxing that monks invented tricks to keep themselves awake. One rumor tells of monks pricking their palms with pins or dipping fingers into cold water. Another story, hard to prove but fun to imagine, claims that some would even press their foreheads against the cold stone pillars, hoping the chill shock would jolt them back from sleep. It's basically the medieval version of blasting icy water on your face before a 4 a.m. shift. And here's the tension. Historians still argue whether every monastery truly kept to such grueling midnight vigils. Some suspect that smaller communities quietly adjusted, praying earlier in the evening or later at dawn, while only the strictest houses followed the rule to the letter. Others believe the very hardship of matins was the point. It separated monks from the rhythms of ordinary life, giving them a sense of spiritual endurance. Whatever the truth, the midnight vigil was legendary, and the candle clock was its accomplice. Imagine standing in that chapel now. The tall candles are measured carefully. each one expected to burn long enough to cover the chanting. You watch the flame shrink notch by notch, signaling when to shift from psalms to readings, then to silence. In that sense, the candle becomes the invisible conductor of the choir, guiding the tempo without ever raising its voice. The psychological effect is heavy. You, a modern visitor, would probably feel your eyelids dragging, your body pleading for a pillow. But the monks, locked into this ritual, lean on the flame as a companion. The soft hiss of wax, the glow against stone, the slow passage of marks. It all tells them, yes, you're awake, you're in prayer, you're in step with the rule. You picture the end of the vigil. The last candle on the altar burns low, pooling wax at its base. The abbot nods, signaling the final chant. Silence falls again. The monks shuffle back to their cells, and the cloister drifts once more into stillness. Outside, the world slumbers unaware, but inside, time has been cut and shaped by fire. The flame in your imagination gutters slightly, and you realize that this midnight discipline, harsh as it seems, carved the monks into people who measured their days not by the sun alone, but by the intimate partnership of candle and bell. You lean back in that silence, knowing that for centuries, countless nights melted away in just this fashion. Wax by wax, prayer by prayer. You lift the candle he's been carrying for hours and notice, almost with a small shock, that it is doing double duty. Not merely slicing the night into hourly pieces, but also whispering the year's larger shape. In the hush of the cloister, the simple column of wax has been recruited to serve as a calendar as much as a clock. In this place, weddings, fasts, and feast days all fold into a liturgical map, and candles, by virtue of their burn and their marking, slot neatly into that map. In broad strokes, medieval Christians lived by the church year, Advent and Christmas, Lent and Easter, saints' days stacked like a tiered cake, and some candle practices reinforce that cycle. Mainstream fact: the Paschal candle, a large, decorated beeswax column lit at the Easter Vigil and kept in churches throughout Eastertide, functioned as a moving axis for the season, symbolizing the light of Christ and serving liturgical purposes for weeks. That single candle could be more ceremonial than utilitarian, but its presence made time feel sacred rather than merely scheduled. You tilt the candle and squint at the grooves. Some candles carry fine lines to mark quarter hours. Others are ringed more broadly to signal longer stretches. Fasts that roll through weeks, a chain of vigils that mark a particular saint's octave. Imagine that instead of waking up and glancing at your phone, you watch the slow progress of a taper to know whether Lent's austerity is almost over or whether a patronal feast is about to fill the refectory with extra bowls of stew. The wax's pace under your eye ties daily rituals to seasonal time. It's a tactile calendar, the world's slow geometry condensed into something you can hold and smell. Legend and rumor stitch into this reality. Some chronicles speak of abbeys preparing neat rows of tapers in Advent to count down to the high feasts. Other houses reportedly kept a long taper to burn in measured stages through Lent, less an hourly device than a seasonal one. These stories are often local and prone to embellishment, so you treat them like whispered margins in the manuscripts you've been reading by firelight. Suggestive, intimate, not always generalizable. And then there is Candlemas, February 2nd, which gives you a literal hint about wax's role in sacred time. Historically, Candlemas involved blessing the year's candles and distributing them to the faithful, ensuring that object used to measure and sanctify time was ritually renewed. You can almost see the sacristan in your mind's eye arranging coils of beeswax, murmuring a blessing, and sending small tapers out to farmers and villagers. That act spreads monastic time into parish households. A blessed taper burns on a mantle, and the abbey's rhythm travels with it. You remember the bees you passed in the apiary. Those same creatures supply not only your nightly comfort, but also the ceremonial lighting for saints and seasons. Monastic account rolls sometimes list pounds of wax alongside grain and wine. Families even left wax in wills to ensure annual lights for a departed soul. That small ledger entry is revealing. Candles were a kind of devotional currency, shaping when and how communities marked time. Historians still argue whether such bequests changed the calendar. Did packed liturgical calendars grow because patrons supplied the wax, or did patrons simply support pre-existing practices? It's a knotty question that folds into larger debates about how material resources shape ritual life. The candle sits at the seam where economy and devotion meet. A softer image comes to you. Convents preserving small shavings of wax from important vigils as keepsakes, tucked into boxes like pressed flowers. The evidence is thin, more rumor than record, but the idea tells you how intimate light could feel. An annual taper burned on a hearth, a niece receiving a candle that had once stood at her grandmother's bedside during a long vigil. These little domestic practices overlay the communal liturgical calendar with private lines of remembrance. Practical adjustments dotted the seasons. In lean winters when bees were scarce, monks burned tallow for everyday needs and held beeswax back for feast days. In those hard years, Candlemas became not only symbolic but logistical, a communal reset during which blessed tapers were distributed and a monastery's light was carefully allocated. The candle thus braided communal liturgy with household timekeeping, the abbey's calendar touching parish life through a simple, blessed wick. The candle calendar also forced moral and financial choices. Which feast merits the clean beeswax? Which vigil gets the long taper? You can almost hear a pragmatic brother in chapter meeting recommending economies of light. Save 3 blocks for the octave of Michaelmas. Use plain tallow for lesser offices. These are not merely bookkeeping details. They are decisions about where attention and honor will be spent. And because wax is fickle, technique mattered. Monks learned to protect lights from drafts, to shelter important tapers behind glass shades, to vary wick thickness to change burn rates. Practical innovations that show how ritual sensitivity and technical know-how walked hand in hand. A season candle, intended to track 40 days, could be ruined by a warm vestry or an unexpected draft. So the liturgical calendar was as much a matter of craft as of piety. There is something gentle and slightly melancholic in the way candles map a year. They give texture to time, rings of burn and scar you could run your fingers along, a faint honeyed scent that recalled spring and the hives. To hold such a candle is to feel the monastery's priorities, what was celebrated widely and what was kept quietly in a cell. You learn that calendars are not purely abstract. They are embodied in material choices, in the wax that melts because someone decided that particular devotion was worth supplying. So you stand there with the taper warming between your fingers, and you understand. The candle-less clock can tell you the hour, but the candle-less calendar tells you a people's year. Its fasts and feasts, its economies and memories, its public rites and private keepsakes. In that double function, time becomes both measured and meaningful. You shift the candle in your palm and catch yourself wondering, what happens when there isn't enough wax? For all the elegance of these light-measured hours, monasteries were not immune to the grim reality of shortages. Bees don't always cooperate, harvests falter, and wars or taxes swallow up resources. Suddenly, time itself feels fragile, because without wax to burn, the abbey loses its quiet metronome. Mainstream fact first. Throughout the Middle Ages, beeswax was precious and often reserved for liturgical use, while tallow, rendered animal fat, served for everyday lighting. Beeswax burned cleaner and brighter, but it was expensive, sometimes controlled through trade guilds or purchased from distant markets. Tallow, meanwhile, smoked, stank faintly of the slaughterhouse, and left greasy soot. A monastery with thin coffers had to make tough choices about which rituals deserved beeswax and which hours could be left to smudgy, cheaper substitutes. You glance around the cloister and imagine the smell of the place changing depending on the candle. On high feasts, the chapel air would shimmer with the faint sweetness of beeswax. On ordinary nights, it might be thick with the acrid tang of tallow. Think of it like swapping between a top-shelf scented candle and a discount emergency tea light. The vibe is just not the same. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Some records suggest truly desperate communities cobbled together makeshift lights out of almost anything that would burn. Dried rushes dipped in fat became rushlights. thin torches stuck upright in holders. Butter, believe it or not, could be pinched into makeshift lamps. There's even a folkloric whisper about Irish households pressing wicks into butter on feast days when beeswax was scarce. Can you picture monks hunched over their psalters with a butter candle, half praying, half wondering if someone will sneak a nibble? It sounds absurd, but when darkness presses hard, practicality often overrides dignity. Yet, historians still argue whether these odd substitutions were widespread in monasteries or mainly confined to poorer households. Some scholars insist the rule of Saint Benedict would have frowned on such makeshift methods, pressing communities to maintain at least a small store of proper wax. Others argue necessity sometimes trumped regulation, and abbots surely bent rules when their only choice was prayer by rushlight or prayer in the dark. Shortages had other ripple effects. Imagine the abbey steward tallying supplies before winter, realizing the wax would not last until Easter. The community might cut back the length of vigils, shorten readings, or even merge services. In essence, wax dictated not only time but also devotion itself. If the candle clock burned faster than expected, prayer life adjusted. There's also a subtle power dynamic at play. Wealthier abbeys could flaunt their prosperity by keeping lavish stores of beeswax, their chapels glowing brilliantly while poorer neighbors stumbled through shadows. Wax became a marker of status. In fact, guilds and even kings sometimes taxed wax imports, knowing how badly monasteries depended on it. That means your humble taper was not just a tool, but a political commodity. Picture yourself trudging into the chapel on a particularly lean winter night. Instead of neat rows of golden tapers, the monks rely on smoky rushlights. The air is hazy, the flame jittery. The wax-measured rhythm falters, too quick here, too sluggish there. You realize how fragile this system really is. Without steady wax, the monks lose not only a clock, but also a sense of cosmic order. And yet, there's something oddly human in these substitutions. Butter lamps, tallow dips, bundles of reeds, they all speak to an instinctive refusal to surrender to darkness. The monks might have grumbled about the stench or the sputter, but they pressed on, refusing to let the night erase their hours. You can almost admire the stubborn practicality. Time will be counted, even if it smells like last week's stew. By the end of the imagined vigil, your throat scratches from smoke, your robe smells like the butcher's yard, and you're longing for a good beeswax candle. But you also recognize the resilience etched into this practice. Candle clocks, in whatever form, meant the monks never gave up on time, even when the bees did. You sit cross-legged on the cold cloister floor and picture the kind of mind it takes to tinker with something as humble as a candle until it becomes an instrument of time. Monks were not just copyists of old texts or singers of psalms. They were also practical innovators, constantly nudging simple tools into clever new forms. The candle clock was never static. Each abbey had its own little twists, born from a brother who thought, what if I added this? The mainstream fact: medieval monasteries were hotbeds of innovation, especially when it came to practical science. Agricultural techniques, brewing, medical remedies, and yes, timekeeping, all benefited from monastic curiosity. Within scriptoria, monks recorded not just scripture but also diagrams of devices, water-driven mills, astrolabes, and occasionally sketches of candle clocks with weights, lines, and drip catchers. Imagine one inventive monk scratching his head after the midnight office, staring at the uneven puddle of wax and thinking, this thing could be better. He tries embedding little metal balls into the wax. As the flame burns down and hits each ball, it drops into a metal pan below with a sharp ping. Suddenly, you've got not just a silent measure but an audible alert, a primitive alarm clock. Practical, a bit startling in the dead of night, but undeniably effective. Now your quirky tidbit. Some accounts mention candles with glass shades, supposedly designed to protect against drafts. But the rumor goes further. One inventive abbot allegedly rigged colored glass chimneys so the flame changed hue as it burned lower. Picture monks chanting under a shifting rainbow. the candle turning from white to green to red like a medieval traffic light. Was it real? Hard to say. The records are fragmentary, but the image is delightful. Liturgy bathed in psychedelic glow centuries before disco. And of course, historians still argue whether most of these inventive tweaks were widespread or just one-off novelties. Some scholars dismiss the alarm ball candle as legend, pointing out how little physical evidence survives. Others argue that the lack of surviving specimens proves nothing. Wax and metal scraps hardly last 900 years. So the debate smolders. Were monks across Europe conducting quiet candle experiments, or were these oddities confined to a few eccentric tinkerers? The joy lies in imagining the scene. You're in a drafty workshop just off the cloister. Shelves sag with lumps of beeswax, pots of tallow, little bundles of wicks, scraps of bronze and glass. A monk in ink-blotched robes leans over a taper, carving neat notches and inserting weights. Another sketches measurements in the margin of a psalter while pretending to copy a psalm. Innovation hums quietly, hidden beneath layers of piety. Some monasteries even tried hybrid devices. There are hints of candles combined with water clocks, so the dripping wax fell steadily into a basin, giving both a visual and audible signal. In other versions, weights tied to the candle's wick descended as the wax melted, pulling on strings that rang bells. You picture it, a candle ticking away invisibly, then suddenly a little bell jingle announcing the passage of an hour. Primitive engineering, yes, but ingenious in its simplicity. The symbolism was not lost on the monks themselves. They often framed their tinkering in spiritual terms. Every adjustment to the candle was a metaphor for vigilance, for the need to mark time faithfully before God. Practical innovation carried a theological cloak. But you can tell, they also enjoyed the craft. Who wouldn't smile the first time a candle dropped a ball into a pan with perfect timing? And there's a modern echo here. Think about your own gadgets, alarms, notifications, flashing lights. The medieval candle, modified by monkish hands, served the same purpose. Instead of vibrations in your pocket, you had wax, flame, and metal. The impulse is timeless. To make sure you don't oversleep, don't miss the meeting, don't slip out of rhythm. As you wander through that workshop in your imagination, you smell hot wax mingling with ink, you hear the faint chime of an experimental contraption, and you realize that the candle clock wasn't just a tool. It was a canvas for invention. Monks may have lived under strict rules, but within the flickering glow of their experiments, they carved out small rebellions of creativity, quiet innovations that kept the hours marching forward. You lean in closer to one of those carefully marked tapers and realize that, for all the ingenuity behind it, the candle clock is still at the mercy of fire's moods. A candle is supposed to burn at a steady rate, straight down, one line at a time, but reality rarely behaves so neatly. Drafts sneak through a chapel door, humidity swells the wick, or the candle tilts ever so slightly in its holder. Suddenly, your perfect little time machine starts lying to you. Here's the mainstream fact. Candle clocks were famously imprecise. Modern experiments with replicas show that even the finest beeswax tapers can vary dramatically, sometimes by 10 or 15 minutes per mark. A gust of air can accelerate one side, a cooler night can slow the melt, and wicks themselves can burn unevenly depending on how tightly they're twisted. Monks knew this. They weren't under illusions that wax rivaled the stars or the clepsydra. But for daily rhythm, especially in the middle of the night when alternatives were impractical, the candle was good enough. Now for your quirky tidbit. One manuscript suggests a trick for correcting the wobble. Supposedly, monks would float a candle in a bowl of water so that as the wax melted, the candle sank lower at a steady pace. The flame stayed upright thanks to the buoyancy. In theory, it eliminated tilt. In practice, you can imagine the chaos, wax dripping into water, the flame sputtering, the whole thing snuffing out with an indignant hiss. It's the medieval equivalent of balancing your phone on the edge of a glass to use as a speaker. Ingenious, messy, and doomed to disappoint. And yet, historians still argue whether the monks cared much about these errors at all. Did they demand mathematical accuracy, or was close enough perfectly fine in a world where sunrise and sunset were already elastic markers? Some scholars insist that candle clocks were symbolic aids more than precise tools. Others argue that monastic rules required as much rigor as possible, meaning even a 5-minute drift was a nuisance. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Precision mattered, but not so much that a wobbly wick unraveled the divine order. Imagine yourself inside the chapel. The abbot has planned the vigil to last until the flame reaches the 5th notch. But tonight the drafty window lets in a sly gust. The flame flickers harder, racing through the wax like a speed reader flipping pages. Suddenly, the service ends 15 minutes early. You picture the monks exchanging glances, half relieved, half guilty. Did God shorten their prayers, or did their candle just cheat? Other nights, the opposite happens. The air is damp, the wick smolders, and the taper drags. By the time the wax reaches its next line, the monks are swaying with exhaustion, muttering the psalms slower and slower. You, standing there in the shadows, can almost taste their frustration. The candle refuses to give the signal, and their bodies refuse to give up. Which is stronger, the discipline of the rule or the stubbornness of wax? This dance between human expectation and natural variability is strangely familiar. Think about your own clocks. The phone that lags, the watch that drifts seconds each day, the alarm you swear you set but somehow missed. The monk's struggle with uneven burning is the same old story. We want certainty, but time always wriggles. And maybe that's the point. For the monks, accepting the candle's flaws was part of humility. They could measure, notch, and mark, but ultimately fire did what it wanted. Their role was to adapt, to pray when summoned, to end when wax allowed, to surrender precision to the mystery of flame. By the end of one long vigil, the last stub of the candle gutters wildly, flaring and dying in uneven bursts. You see monks bowing, tired but resigned, knowing tomorrow the same dance will repeat. Candle clocks, in their imperfection, reminded them that time belonged not to men but to something greater, flickering and fragile as a flame in the dark. You watch a brother lift a tall, gleaming taper and carry it toward the altar, and suddenly the atmosphere shifts. This is no ordinary stick of wax meant to sputter through matins. This is a decorated candle, almost a sculpture, reserved for ritual. It towers over the ordinary tapers, smooth and golden, embossed with saints and crosses, sometimes even set into elaborate stands of brass or wood. The candle clock here is not only a timer, it's a symbol glowing with layers of meaning. The mainstream fact: the most famous of these decorated ritual candles was the Paschal candle, lit at Easter and used through the season to mark the resurrection. Tradition demanded it be made of pure beeswax, symbolizing purity. In some churches, it was enormous, thicker than a man's arm and tall enough to stand at shoulder height. Monks would carve the current year into it, along with the Alpha and Omega letters, reminding the congregation that Christ encompassed all time. Every Easter vigil, as the candle was blessed and carried into the dark church, it became a monumental timekeeper, measuring not just hours but a sacred season. Now for your quirky tidbit. Medieval artisans sometimes molded candles into surprising shapes. Records mention candles carved with spirals or adorned with wax medallions showing saints' faces, almost like 3D icons. A few legends even claim that some abbeys experimented with trick candles that released perfumes as they burned. Imagine chanting through Compline as faint wafts of frankincense and honey drift around you. Whether or not every abbey indulged, the rumor hints that candles were not always plain utilities, but also sensory experiences, designed to dazzle worshippers who might otherwise doze off in the flickering half-light. And here's where scholars still argue. Were these lavish ritual candles truly used as functional clocks, or purely symbolic lights? Some insist that decorated candles were meant to impress and instruct, but weren't notched or measured. Others believe even the Grand Paschal candle had markings to help pace the Easter vigil through the long night. The absence of clear instructions leaves us guessing, caught between symbolism and practicality. You imagine yourself in the chapel during one of these feast nights. The monks chant in rhythm, incense curls upward, and that towering Paschal candle burns steadily at the center. Its flame throws golden highlights across the carved saints on its side, each figure shimmering as though alive. The candle doesn't just measure the vigil, it embodies it. Every moment is sanctified by light that is not only practical, but also beautiful. The impact is psychological. Ordinary candle clocks whisper to the monks in their cells, nudging them from hour to hour. But these decorated ritual candles shout with authority. They remind you that time itself has been claimed by faith, that the minutes and hours belong not to sleepy monks, but to eternity. You might feel awed, or perhaps a little small, as though you're watching a clock far larger than yourself tick down with solemn grace. At the close of the feast, the decorated candle is extinguished with ceremony. Smoke drifts into the rafters, and you realize you've witnessed more than the passage of hours. You've seen the monastery frame time itself as sacred art. The candle's wax may shrink, but the memory of its glow lingers, carved into the rhythm of both the liturgy and your imagination. You cross into the guest house, a narrow wing of the monastery softened by straw and stew, where the public rhythms of the cloister meet the private weariness of travelers. Pilgrims arrive with mud dried into the hems of their cloaks, the smell of open roads in their hair. For someone who has walked miles under sun and rain, a single lit taper at the bedside is a small miracle. It says plainly that someone will watch the gate, that a bowl of hot food will be set, that you may sleep without fear of being turned out into the night. Mainstream fact, monastic tradition, strongly shaped by the rule of Saint Benedict, placed hospitality at the heart of communal life. Many monasteries maintained guest houses, hospitia, to lodge pilgrims, providing shelter, food, and spiritual care. These were practical operations in which candles and hearths played a central, everyday role. The guest hall is dim and functional. Wooden beds line the walls, each with a small light. A taper of beeswax for honored visitors, cheaper tallow dips or rushlights for the majority. The placement of flame is deliberate. A candle at a bed's head marks occupancy and helps guide bleary travelers to their bunks. A central light allows strangers to move without shouting. The taper performs the pragmatic work that a doorman might in a city inn. It establishes borders, signals safety, and says in amber hush that this house has taken you in. You learn the etiquette quickly. A monk or steward will guide you to your bunk, steadying a candle in his palm to shield the flame from drafts. He will tell you in a low voice the household's rhythms. We rise with the bell. Do not leave until the steward's notch shows. A simple notch scratched into a taper translates monastic hours into actionable instruction for a tired stranger. The light becomes both instructor and covenant. Sometimes the candle carries a symbolic ticket. Pilgrims were sometimes given small blessed tapers as mementos when they left. A taper blessed at an abbey and carried back to a distant village could be burned at a family altar as a sign that prayers were being offered at the house that sheltered the traveler. That quirky custom is the tactile cousin of a pilgrim badge or a scallop shell, portable proof of being seen and prayed for on a journey. Candles also regulate movement inside and outside the priory. A curfew candle placed at the gate or arch would be watched. When it burned down to a certain mark, or was extinguished, doors would be closed and latecomers politely but firmly denied entry. Conversely, the steward's morning taper or the sight of bell-lit candles indicated when guests might break their fast and depart. These light signals were practical measures in an era when roads were dangerous after dark, and when a visible flame could guide a weary foot off a muddy verge and into safety. Historians still argue about the uniformity and scale of monastic hospitality. Some scholars portray an extensive, semi-formal network in which abbeys coordinated lodging and support across regions. Others stress a more localized, improvisational system dependent on each house's finances and goodwill. It's likely the reality mixed both. Certain well-known pilgrimage routes had fairly reliable services, while small or remote houses offered aid more sporadically. Economic realities shaped practice. Beeswax was valuable, and ghost houses often rationed it. Wealthier patrons might be given a private taper or kept an oratory light, whereas poorer guests received communal rushlights. Stewards kept ledgers noting names, nights, and sometimes wax given as payment in kind. A bequest of wax in a will could secure perpetual masses or a guaranteed shelter each year. In this way, wax was both devotion and currency, underwriting hospitality and binding networks of care. The lights also helped navigation. On large estates, a row of bracketed lanterns led to the guest gate, and in bad weather a clutch of torches or lanterns drew travelers off dark paths toward safety. In regions where bogs and forests erased lanes at night, the sight of a priory's glow was a life-saving beacon. The monastery's lamps were visible signposts in a landscape otherwise indifferent to the wandering foot. Personal anecdotes linger in the archives. A chronicler records a novice who attempted to snuff the curfew candle to sneak into Market Town. He was discovered by the steward and shamed before the house. Another tale tells of a traveling widow who, grateful for a warm bed, donated a block of beeswax to the guest house, an offering that kept lights burning for months. These small stories reveal the human economy braided into the practice. Rule, mercy, mischief, and gratitude all folded together around the flame. There is tenderness in the practical gestures. An infirmarian might tuck a spare taper beside a coughing traveler. A kind brother might press a thumb to a taper's side to notch it as a favor, granting an extra quarter hour before the bell. Such small acts turn a tool of temporal regulation into an instrument of care. The candle becomes a social implement the community uses to manage risk and to express compassion. At the same time, hospitality carried obligations. Scholars note that monasteries sometimes used their ghost houses to extend influence, soliciting donations or recording names in books that tied visitors to future prayers and liturgical obligations. Hospitality could be both charitable and strategic. A night's shelter might foster a bond that brought donations or political favor. The candle, then, marks both kindness and a way institutions knit people into wider networks. You will also see technical ingenuity applied to hospitable ends. Remember the clanging pins and weighted tricks we've met before, and the butter candle experiments that smelled faintly of the larder? In a guest house context, such devices might serve to wake a steward or rouse a sick traveler without disturbing the whole dormitory. Simple glass chimneys and wind guards kept important tapers steady in drafty halls. The technical quirks of wax matter here because someone's comfort or safety can depend on a light that must last through the night. Think of major pilgrimage arteries, Camino de Santiago, the Via Francigena, and imagine monasteries along these roads as nodes in an informal map of mercy. In busy seasons, ghost houses swelled with peasants, merchants, nobles, and children crammed into dim halls. Candle allocation became a logistics problem. Who gets the long beeswax taper for an all-night vigil, and who must make do with a rushlight? Departure had its own small rituals. A steward might notch a taper to signal the precise minute you may leave so you avoid a toll collector or meet a ferry. Pilgrims sometimes offered a prayer before extinguishing a taper as a gesture of gratitude. Blessed tapers taken home could be burned at family altars, and thus brought a brief abbey's care into a household's calendar. Scholars still debate whether hospitality reinforced social hierarchies. Some point to inclusive rhetoric in monastic rules and abundant records of aid to the poor. Others show that elites often received better provisioning and that ghost houses could function as instruments of patronage. Once again, the candle acts as a clue. Brighter tapers for prominent guests, rushlights for the destitute, and stewards' accounts that quietly record difference. There is a human consolation in all this. The candle per bed is an older version of the modern hostel volunteer or night nurse, the small, often unseen work of tending strangers. In the hush of the dormitory, you feel a fragile covenant surrounding you. The monastic community has, for a night, folded you into its rhythm. A shard of wax tucked into your pack, and the faint honeyed scent on your fingers will remind you miles down the road that you were cared for. Ultimately, The guest house candle is modest technology, but its simplicity is its genius. Any traveler can read the flame. No formal training is required to learn its signals. For one night, the taper translates institutional time into actions you can follow. In that fragile, honey-scented glow, you experience a small diplomacy between stranger and community. The candle is, briefly, your interpreter, your witness, and your shelter. You wander from the guest house toward the market square just outside the monastery wall, where flickers of flame are no longer symbols of prayer, but instruments of trade. Here the same wax that measured vigils and penances becomes commodity, bartered and weighed, stacked in honey-scented rolls like treasure laid out on rough-hewn tables. Candlelight in this space is neither sacrament nor mercy. It is business, and you smell that practical truth in the mingled odors of tallow smoke, wet wool, and onions frying in a vendor's pan. Mainstream historical fact. In the Middle Ages, monasteries often controlled local economies, and wax production and candle sales were significant sources of income. Abbeys owned hives, processed beeswax, and sold finished tapers to townspeople, especially since beeswax burned longer and cleaner than common tallow candles. A merchant holds up two tapers side by side, beckoning a crowd. One is yellowish-white, beeswax from monastic hives. The other is murky, gray, and stinking faintly of smoke, common tallow from animal fat. He lets you see how one burns with steady flame while the other sputters. The difference is obvious even in open air, and customers nod, calculating whether a cleaner room is worth the higher price. The monastery's stall has no need for theatrics. Their seals alone tell buyers this wax was blessed by association with prayer. The quirky tidbit? Some stalls offered novelty candles, dyed red with madder root, shaped like flowers or twisted braids, even small candles formed in molds of saints. They were less about illumination and more about charm, trinkets of wax that pleased children or wealthy patrons who wanted a little whimsy. Imagine a medieval child begging for a saint-shaped candle the way a modern child pleads for a toy. Coins clink, but wax also trades as barter. A farmer might hand over a clutch of eggs or a sack of rye in exchange for rushlights. A widow might pay for lodging in wax instead of coin, knowing the monastery values it as much as silver. Wax becomes liquid currency, the luminous medium in which credit and trust are written. Historians still argue whether monasteries cornered this wax trade intentionally, monopolizing supply by controlling bees and beekeeping land, or whether they simply filled a market niche nobody else was able to manage at scale. Evidence from charters and ledgers suggests both. Some abbeys jealously guarded hive rights. Others treated wax as incidental surplus. The debate remains unresolved because the records vary by region. You see buyers fumble coins in nervous fingers, worried whether they've bought enough. After all, candle count is time. Too few, and you eat or pray in dark. Too many, and you waste money. Monastic stewards whisper advice, teaching townsfolk how to measure a taper against a known span. A prayer said 10 times, a meal that lasts the length of a hand's breadth of wax. There are spectacles too. Public auctions of wax remnants, stubs left from church services, draw thrifty townsfolk, called sanctified ends. These little pieces of candle were prized not only for cheap light, but for supposed protection against storms or sickness. A quirky superstition, but one that kept even scraps in demand. The square itself becomes a theater of negotiation. Candle sellers boast about longer burn times, exaggerating with hand gestures as if stretching the hours themselves. Customers challenge them, recalling a taper that guttered too soon. Reputation matters. One faulty batch can stain a monastery's name. The candle market, like any economy, thrives on trust. And when dusk falls, the square itself blooms with demonstration flames. Rows of candles lit side by side, glowing like stars on earth. Buyers lean close, judging brightness, squinting through smoke. Children chase moths that dart toward the glow, while hawkers cry. 2 rushlights for a farthing, but beeswax for eternity. The monastery is not simply a supplier, but also regulator. Officials inspect measures of tallow, ensuring weights are honest. Priors sometimes set prices to prevent gouging during winter shortages. Candle trade becomes part of the moral economy, where cheating is not just commerce but sin. Picture the silent ledger room within the abbey. Wax tallied in pounds, shavings weighed like coin, debts recorded against notches in sticks. Every candle that flickers in the market has a shadow in that ledger. And yet, behind all this order, you still see small absurdities. A friar once complained that merchants cut tallow with butter, making candles that dripped rancid fat and stank like a kitchen gone wrong. Another chronicler tells of a prankster who molded a candle with a coin inside so that, when it melted, the hidden metal clinked into the basin, astonishing the crowd. Wax is practical, but wax is also playful, unpredictable, and occasionally scandalous. Step back a little, and you notice how the square itself is timed by flame. At dawn, sellers light torches to set up stalls. By midday, the sun itself is enough, and most flames are snuffed. But when twilight comes, the stall fronts are lit again, now not for display but for use, as buyers hurry to secure light for the night. The market breathes by fire, its rhythm punctuated by smoke and glow. In this world, you learn that a candle is more than a stick of wax. It is a measure of faith, a token of hospitality, and here, in the square, a coin of the realm. To buy a taper is to purchase not just light but time, safety, and dignity. And when you carry your purchase back through the gate, the flame you cradle in a clay lantern is both merchandise and meaning, linking the noisy square with the silent cloister. You carry that purchased taper in your hand, walking back through stone archways until you stand in the cloister again, this time beneath the tower that houses the bells. The air is cooler here, vibrating faintly as if even the stone remembers sound. You notice how candles and bells, two very different instruments, somehow share the same task: telling time, carving day into knowable slices. The monks do not trust either one alone. They weave them together, so that flame and bronze form a duet. Mainstream historical fact. Monastic life followed the canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. These were traditionally announced by bells, but candles and lamps often helped measure the intervals between, particularly in the long nights before dawn, when bells could not always be struck without confusion. You tilt your head as the bell swings, the vibration settling into your ribs. A brother nearby holds a long taper to check the hour until the next peal. He knows, by counting drips or by measuring how far the wick has descended, whether they are on schedule. The bells call outward, to fields and town, while the candle whispers inward, to the cloistered community. One is loud and public, the other is quiet and private. Together, they give the monastery both lungs with which to breathe. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some abbeys, monks actually tied bells to candles. As the flame consumed wax, a thread tied to a small clapper would eventually release, ringing a minor chime. Imagine the strange little sound of a bell tinkling because a candle melted. It's both practical timekeeping and a kind of accidental music. You notice, too, the politics of sound and sight. Bells could carry for miles, announcing monastic authority to villages. Candles, in contrast, remained secret, internal. Historians still argue whether monasteries used their bells primarily for liturgy or also as instruments of social power, reminding peasants of monastic dominance by ringing day and night. The candle complicates that argument, because flame regulated the monks even when no one outside could see. The synergy shows up in rituals. During night offices, a single candle might be placed beneath a suspended bell rope. Its glow just enough for the ringer to see when to pull. Without the taper, the bell could not be rung at the right moment. Without the bell, the candle's private time would remain confined to the cloister. Together, they created harmony between enclosed rhythm and public declaration. Think of the daily choreography. At none, a bell clangs over the fields, calling laborers to pause, while inside, a line of candles burns evenly to mark the chanting monk's pace. When the hymn is finished, both flame and sound resolve into silence. This interplay is how the monastery stitched its hours across both inside and outside worlds. Candles also smoothed the gaps between bells. Metal might crack, clappers might break, or storms might silence the sound. In such cases, the community relied on wax to keep rhythm steady. And conversely, when candles guttered in wind, the bell's authoritative boom steadied the hours. One can even see it as redundancy in a fragile system. In a world without mechanical clocks, time was stitched together by overlapping signals. You needed the bell's public reach, the candle's intimate precision, the sun's arc, and the monk's memory, all braided to resist error. Imagine sitting beneath the bell tower late at night, listening to distant echoes while watching wax shrink. The rhythm becomes hypnotic. Boom, silence, drip, hiss. The monastery becomes a body whose heartbeats are bells and whose breathing is flame. Even here, human quirks emerge. Chroniclers tell of bell ringers who napped too long and were rescued by the humble candle, whose pin-drop mechanism clinked a small bell and woke them. Others record disputes. Did the bell ring too early, or did the candle burn too fast? Accuracy became an object of friendly rivalry, with some monks swearing by wax, others by bronze. That rivalry reflects a bigger scholarly debate. Was medieval time kept primarily for prayer, or did it also drift into regulating work, trade, and wider society? Historians still argue whether the monastery's careful blend of candle and bell accidentally laid groundwork for later public time discipline. The factory bell, the school bell, the work shift. As you linger, you realize that the synergy is less about technology and more about trust. A community cannot run on sound alone, nor on flame alone. But together, light guiding hand, bell guiding ear, they knit a rhythm that feels inevitable like the tide. And in that recognition, you see why the monks counted not just with bells, not just with candles, but with both. Time here is not one voice, but a chorus. You slip from the tower into the cloister's small infirmary, a low-roofed chamber where the air smells of herbs, linen, and faint smoke from gently burning lamps. Here candle clocks do more than call to prayer or trade. They measure the fragile spaces between sickness and health, sleep and waking, life and death. You find yourself walking softer, as though the shadows themselves request silence. Mainstream historical fact. Monastic infirmaries functioned as some of the best medical facilities in medieval Europe, combining herbal remedies, regulated diets, and care under religious supervision. Time was crucial. Patients needed medication at set intervals, and prayers were offered regularly for the sick. Without mechanical clocks, candles often served as the measure. Picture a weary monk nurse bending over a bed, squinting at a tall taper scored with ink marks. Each line represents a portion of an hour. When the wax melts to that notch, a draught of syrup or a prayer is due. The candle becomes both physician's assistant and spiritual aid. A single flame could mean the difference between missing a dose or delivering care on time. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some infirmaries experimented with scented clocks. Monks infused wax with herbs like lavender, thyme, or even rosemary. As the candle burned, a faint fragrance would spread. Lavender perhaps at midnight, thyme at dawn, subtle signals that it was time for another turn of treatment. Imagine the patient, half dreaming, breathing in lavender and knowing without opening their eyes that the next watch had begun. Historians still argue whether such candles were common or rare luxuries. Some accounts suggest widespread practice. Others believe these were curiosities noted precisely because they were unusual. Surviving fragments of herbal-infused wax are scant, so the debate lingers unresolved. In this infirmary, you notice the candles are carefully shielded, set in glass or horn casings to protect them from drafts. Precision matters here. A guttering flame could mean a missed hour, a skipped chant, or a medicine spoiled by waiting too long. Each taper is tended like a patient in its own right, trimmed and checked so its testimony remains true. You also hear prayers murmured over wax. The sick often requested blessed candles to burn near their beds, believing the holy flame would comfort them or frighten away evil spirits. Some monasteries even kept special stock, thick healing candles, decorated with painted symbols, meant to burn through a vigil of intercession. The line between practical timekeeping and spiritual reassurance blurred until they became one and the same. The infirmarian uses the candle in another way too. At night he does not dare strike the bell for every turn, lest he wake the healthy. Instead, he reads the wax silently, moving from bed to bed, a flame cupped in hand. Patients drift between worlds to the rhythm of drip and hiss, scarcely aware that their care is bound to a strip of beeswax measured against the long dark. A whispered tale. One chronicle tells of a patient so soothed by candlelight that he asked the brothers to promise him a taper would always burn at his side, even if he died. They did, and his funeral procession carried the same candle that had timed his final nights. Wax marked both his hours of breath and his hour of departure. Step further into the ward, and you find candles used for diagnosis. A monk might hold a taper near a patient's face to study complexion, or by urine samples in glass flasks, judging color by firelight. Wax, in this context, becomes an instrument of observation, as necessary as herbs or scalpels. Yet not everything is solemn. A novice, bored on night duty, once carved faces into the soft side of a candle, creating a grotesque parade of melting visages. His superior scolded him, but patients laughed quietly. Perhaps the small mischief did more good than harm. This mingling of seriousness and play mirrors scholarly tension. Was monastic medicine truly advanced, or was it little more than ritual wrapped in prayer? Historians still argue. Some emphasize real progress, herbal compounds, regulated diets, careful timing. Others insist the science was largely symbolic, relying on relics and ritual. The candle, practical yet mystical, embodies that paradox perfectly. You realize the infirmary candle does triple duty. It marks the hour of treatment, it comforts the fearful, and it illuminates the work of healing. In its quiet glow, time itself feels like medicine, steady, measured, reliable. Patients can surrender to the dark because they trust someone is counting the hours faithfully in flame. And you, standing in that chamber, almost hear the wax whisper. Not all time is punishment or obligation. Some time is simply care stretched gently across the night. You drift from the infirmary into the scriptorium, that hushed chamber where quills scratch parchment and monks bend over desks lit by orderly lines of flame. Here, candles do not only regulate hours of prayer or healing, they carve the rhythm of knowledge itself. Every book copied, every margin illuminated, every letter shaped like a tiny cathedral arch is made possible because wax stands steady against the dark. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval scriptoria relied on artificial light, especially during winter, to extend working hours. Candle clocks allowed scribes to portion their labor and maintain consistency in long copying sessions. Without this system, production of manuscripts, those vast libraries of devotion, law, and learning, would have slowed to a crawl. The air smells of parchment dust, ink made from gall nuts, and beeswax smoke. The light is angled carefully. Too many flames warp the page, while too few strain the eyes. Each scribe has a taper marked with notches, ensuring he knows when to rest, pray, or hand his work to the next. The candle becomes the metronome for human endurance, coaxing out a steady pace rather than frantic bursts. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some scribes pressed coins or small bits of metal into the wax, so that when the candle reached a certain level, the object would fall onto the desk with a clink, an audible reminder to stretch or switch tasks. Imagine a monk jumping slightly at the sound, realizing 2 hours had vanished under his quill. A medieval version of a kitchen timer. Historians still argue whether scriptoria depended more on natural daylight than on candles. Some scholars believe candlelight was too costly to burn in large quantities, limiting night work. Others argue that the abundance of wax recorded in monastic accounts suggests heavy reliance on artificial light, especially in northern climates where winter days were short. The truth likely varied. Some houses were lavishly supplied, others frugal. The scene is both industrious and oddly intimate. Candles are clustered to prevent drafts, their flames bent toward parchment like conspirators. A drop of wax seals a quire of pages. A different drop lands accidentally, preserved for centuries as evidence of a monk's tired hand. Scholars examining manuscripts today sometimes find faint wax stains in margins, ghosts of the very candles that measured their creation. The candle clock here also disciplines the imagination. Illuminators painting saints in shell gold or ultramarine glance up at wax levels to know when to stop before fatigue spoils a halo or tremor ruins a vine scroll. Time is not only obligation, it is protection against human frailty, guarding beauty from sloppy hands. And sometimes, inevitably, accidents happen. A chronicler tells of a novice who nodded off, letting his sleeve brush a taper, scorching half a folio. The abbot scolded, but later generations cherished the flawed manuscript, noting the singe as testimony that even holy work is fragile. Another tale tells of a monk who carved riddles into candle wax, so that as it burned the letters appeared one by one, a secret entertainment during long hours. Walk between desks and you feel the tension. The candles urge both discipline and temptation. A steady flame insists on consistency. A wavering flame seduces eyes into daydream. The candle thus measures not just hours but human attention, holding scribes between monotony and inspiration. This raises another scholarly debate. Were scriptoria primarily engines of devotion, preserving texts for prayer, or were they also workshops of broader knowledge, feeding law courts, medicine, and secular poetry? Candles illuminate both sacred psalters and bawdy fabliaux, sometimes copied side by side. Historians still argue whether monks saw this as contradiction or simply as the fullness of God's creation. Imagine the soundscape: scratch of quill, sigh of breath, faint hiss of wax. Outside, bells boom. Inside, a candle falls silent as it marks the passing of an hour. Knowledge grows in these measured silences, expanding like ripples across vellum. And when a scribe finally blows out his taper, the smoke curls upward like a punctuation mark at the end of the day's work. That thin tendril is history itself, dissipating yet leaving behind words that will outlast both monk and wax. You realize that without these candle clocks, countless manuscripts would have remained unwritten, and the great echo of medieval thought might have dimmed to a whisper. The flame is not merely a servant to the scribe. It is co-author, pacing the work, ensuring that letters march in even lines toward the survival of memory. You leave the scriptorium with ink-stained fingers and wander down to the refectory, where monks gather not to write or heal but to eat. Even here, candles govern more than shadows. They portion the rhythm of meals, regulate silence, and remind hungry bellies that eating is itself a ritual. The smell of cabbage broth and fresh bread mingles with beeswax smoke, filling the hall with a domestic sacredness. Mainstream historical fact: monastic rules often specified exact times for meals, typically once in the late morning and once in the evening. Candle clocks helped regulate these hours, especially in winter when daylight was unreliable. They were also used to time the length of meals, ensuring no indulgence stretched too far. Picture long trestle tables, bowls steaming, spoons waiting. At the center of the hall stands a tall candle marked with neat notches. As it burns down notch by notch, the steward watches closely. When the flame reaches a certain line, the lector finishes reading aloud, the brothers fold their hands, and the meal concludes. The taper thus acts as host, setting pace and boundaries. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some monasteries experimented with edible candles made of hardened lard or butter, with a wick set inside. In times of famine or on feast days, the candle could be cut and eaten. Imagine the laughter as a monk solemnly trims what looks like a taper and spreads it on bread. Half joke, half survival tactic, but it happened. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or exceptional. Some claim edible candles were common in northern monasteries during harsh winters. Others dismiss them as anecdotes blown out of proportion. The debate remains lively because so few direct records survive, and most references are tinged with humor. Meanwhile, the ordinary wax candle enforces discipline. Meals in many monasteries were silent, with only the lector's voice carrying scripture or hagiography through the air. The candle ensured that silence had length. No monk could linger too long over an extra ladle of stew. When the wax reached the end, spoons dropped, bowls were stacked, and fasting resumed until the next appointed time. Candles also helped coordinate kitchen work. The cook timed his boiling pots by wax measure. One candle for lentils, another for fish. In the absence of sandglasses or clocks, wax became recipe keeper. A chronicler even jokes about a brother whose fish always tasted burnt because he forgot to light his kitchen candle clock. Yet wax did more than pace hunger, it sanctified it. Some candles were blessed and placed near food as symbols of divine provision. Others were decorated with painted lines showing not just hours but feast days, burned down notch by notch until Easter or Advent. Meals became little rehearsals of larger liturgical rhythms. Accidents, of course, crept in. A novice once tipped a candle into a soup pot, creating a slick of wax that made the dish inedible. Another story tells of wax dripping onto a loaf of bread, which the monks ate anyway, crunching beeswax like seeds between their teeth. Such stories remind you that discipline lived side by side with clumsiness. In the refectory, the candle also softened human tension. A brother irritated by hunger could glance at the flame and know precisely how long he must wait. The taper offered certainty where stomachs offered complaint. Hunger measured is hunger managed. This reflects a wider scholarly debate. Were monasteries engines of ascetic self-denial, or did they provide structured comfort in an age of chaos? Candles, regulating meals to the minute, suggest both. They restrained indulgence but also guaranteed fairness. No one ate less or more than allotted. Historians still argue whether that balance leaned more toward control or care. As you sit among the monks, spoon in hand, you notice the flame's steadiness calming the room. Even without words, everyone knows when the meal will end. The candle teaches patience, equality, and humility, not by shouting, but by burning. And when at last the steward snuffs the flame, silence folds back into the cloister. Hunger is satisfied, the rhythm is kept, and the taper has done its work. After the refectory, you drift into the chapter house, a place where monks gather daily to hear scripture, receive instructions, and confess faults. Here, too, candles burn with authority, not just for light but for rhythm and tone. The chapter meetings could last mere minutes or stretch into hours depending on disputes, readings, or penances. Without clocks, wax decided. Mainstream historical fact. Monasteries across Europe structured much of their communal life in chapter meetings, where abbots read from the rule of Saint Benedict and assigned work. A candle or set of candles often served as a timekeeper to ensure that no one spoke too long or that meetings did not drift endlessly. Picture the scene. A single tall candle stands at the center of the chamber. Its flame flickers across the cold stone walls, highlighting downcast faces. When a monk rises to confess a fault, say, speaking out of turn or failing to wake for matins, his allotted time is literally measured in wax. The flame consumes his words. If the candle burns past a certain line, the abbot gently signals him to stop. This produced an unusual atmosphere. Every brother knew his tongue was racing against fire. It created brevity, humility, and at times panic. Imagine stammering out your guilt while watching the wick curl downward. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some monasteries supposedly used double-wicked candles in chapter meetings. Two flames rose side by side, burning unevenly, a physical reminder of discord within the community. When both flames reached the wax base, the meeting had to end, whether reconciliation was reached or not. While records are scarce, the symbolism feels too vivid to dismiss entirely. Historians debate the accuracy of such tales. Some see them as allegorical stories written centuries later. Others suggest they were genuine practices in certain abbeys known for inventive symbolism. The lack of physical remnants, no surviving double-wicked tapers, leaves the matter unresolved. Even with ordinary candles, accidents could shape memory. In one chronicle, a candle sputtered out mid-confession, plunging the chapter house into darkness. The abbot declared it divine judgment and excused the monk without punishment. Another account describes a candle toppling onto parchment minutes before a brother was named to discipline, a sign interpreted either as God's mercy or Satan's mischief. Scholars note that the candle here became more than timer, it was arbiter. Its sudden behavior could tilt decisions, its endurance could lengthen mercy, its weakness could shorten reprimand. In an age without mechanical neutrality, wax carried moral weight. One unresolved scholarly debate concerns how strictly time was actually measured. Some argue candles were symbolic, marking presence rather than precision. Others insist that monastic discipline was obsessed with exactitude, and candles were carefully calibrated, perhaps even tested beforehand. Without surviving technical manuals, certainty is elusive. Beyond timing, candles shaped the emotional tone. Their soft glow encouraged reflection, muted anger, and reinforced humility. Confessing under sunlight might feel public and harsh, but confessing under firelight felt intimate, almost confessional in the modern sense. Wax softened judgment. It is worth noting that chapter houses were also places of governance, where abbots managed estates, tenants, and political disputes. Here the candle took on another role, ensuring business didn't consume the day. The wax, burning steadily, reminded even powerful abbots that time was not infinite, that decisions must be made before the taper died. So in the chapter house, candles balanced speech and silence, confession and governance. They were impartial rulers, quiet yet relentless. And when at last the meeting ended, the brothers filed out, each one reminded that his words had burned away like wax. Time had passed, guilt was absolved, duties reassigned. The candle remained only as a stub, proof that governance itself was measured flame by flame. You step into the infirmary now, the quietest wing of the monastery. Here the walls seem to hum with suppressed groans, whispered prayers, and the rustle of straw mattresses. Candles glow along the narrow aisles, their light falling on pale faces and bandaged limbs. If time in the cloister is measured for prayer, and in the chapter house for speech, then in the infirmary it is measured for healing, or perhaps for waiting out the inevitable. Mainstream historical fact. Monasteries often served as centers of medical care, not only for monks but sometimes for travelers, pilgrims, and the local poor. Candles were indispensable here, providing steady light for procedures such as bloodletting, wound cleaning, or the careful preparation of herbal poultices. Without them, even the most skilled infirmarian could not see what he was doing once the sun dipped behind cloister walls. Now the quirky tidbit. In certain accounts, candles were said to double as rudimentary diagnostic tools. A monk might hold a taper near a patient's face, not simply for illumination, but to study how the flickering flame reflected in the eyes. If pupils failed to constrict, he suspected fever. If the flame bent oddly toward the mouth, he whispered that the patient's breath carried sickness strong enough to tug the air. Whether medical science or sheer imagination, this kind of observation turned wax into a crude diagnostic device. Yet historians still argue whether monks truly innovated here, or whether later writers romanticized the idea of candlelit diagnostics. Some scholars dismiss it as fanciful storytelling, noting no systematic treatises on flame medicine survive. Others argue that the silence itself is telling, that monks kept such lore orally, wary of being accused of superstition. Even beyond medicine, candles in the infirmary were powerful symbols. For the dying, a candle was lit and placed near the bed as a vigil light, its flame representing the soul's passage. You can picture it, a monk lying still, his brothers murmuring psalms, while the flame wavers each time he exhales. For the living, the same flame might offer hope, but for the dying, it marked the threshold, a fragile thread between earth and eternity. In some monasteries, special mortuary candles were kept, large and long-lasting, so the flame would not fail during an all-night vigil beside the dying. These candles might be adorned with simple crosses, melted carefully afterward so no fragment was wasted. The wax that had burned at a deathbed was sometimes gathered and pressed into new tapers, an act of recycling that carried heavy spiritual overtones. One account tells of a miraculous recovery. A brother thought near death was given a candle to hold as he faded. He gripped it tightly, and though the wax dripped painfully onto his hand, he refused to let go. By morning, he had revived, the candle stub still in his grasp. Whether coincidence or divine intervention, the story circulated as proof of faith's endurance. The infirmary candles were also pragmatic timers. Healing rituals, or the recitation of certain prayers for the sick, were paced by burning wax. A taper lit at the beginning of a poultice application might indicate when to remove it. When the wick reached a notch, it was time to change the dressing. In a place where no sandglass ticked, fire itself became the ticking hand. And of course, not all stories are solemn. There are whispers of brothers sneaking into the infirmary to shorten their chores. By trimming an inch off the candle before lighting, they could hasten the end of the duty watch, claiming time had flown when really wax had been clipped. Whether punishable mischief or clever ingenuity, it shows how human even the cloister could be. So, in this quiet wing, candles were both healers and heralds, steady companions in suffering. They gave sight to the infirmarian's hands, lent comfort to the frightened, marked the passage of treatment, and flickered with spiritual promise. And when the room fell into hush, you noticed that each flame seemed to breathe in rhythm with the patients themselves, tiny souls of wax holding vigil over bodies both frail and strong. You watch, curious and a little guarded, as iron begins to breathe alongside the warm, familiar light of wax. The monastery's soundscape shifts, no longer only hiss and drip and the soft scrape of quills, but now a deliberate clank and the slow, mechanical whisper of gears. For centuries, time here has been intimate, measured by candle, bell, and human attention. But suddenly a new kind of time arrives, the gear-toothed, metal-ticking time of mechanical clocks. You feel the change like a draft slipping under the door. It is small at first, then everywhere. Imagine an enormous wooden frame, its face unfinished, with a crude escapement clattering away inside. Mainstream fact. The first mechanical clocks began to appear in European monasteries in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, replacing earlier devices and providing a more continuous, audible measure of hours. They did not look like your neat tower clocks at first. They were mechanical beasts, heavy, noisy, and demanding maintenance. Historians still argue about precise origins and attribution, but these early machines altered how communities experienced the day. You stand near the tower as the clattering begins. A lay mechanic, hired for his knack with cog and spindle, has come to fit the monastery with a primitive verge and foliate system. Monks gather, some with hands folded, some with sleeves smudged in soot, watching each iron tooth engage the next. The mechanism greets you like an unfamiliar animal, slow, periodic, and indifferent to drafts. Where candles had been tender measures, this clock is blunt, insistent, and public. There is a subtle theology at stake. For generations, monks have seen time as both gift and test. A taper melts, and you observe your hours like a small exercise in humility. A mechanical clock proposes a different posture. Time as something to be measured externally, detached, and standardized. Some brothers welcome it as an aid to discipline, others view it as an intrusion, an iron eye that counts without conscience. The debate over whether mechanical time is theologically good or spiritually corrosive hums in whispers across the cloister. Now for a quirky aside. One chronicle, more theatrical than precise, tells of a bell ringer who protested a new clock by lacing its weights with rotten fruit, hoping to sabotage the mechanism. The sabotage, predictably, stank up the room, and the clock kept ticking anyway until the lay brothers cleaned the mess. Whether true or apocryphal, the tale captures how disruptive the device could feel. It was not merely technology, but a social provocation. The practical benefits are obvious. A mechanical clock can strike the hours audibly and continually, regardless of how many candles remain or whether a fog has smothered starlight. It can regulate work shifts, ring the bell at precise intervals, and coordinate activities across a larger complex, especially useful when monasteries run mills, farms, and outreach. You sense new efficiency threading through the building. one gear training dozens of tasks and replacing some of the old bargaining with time. Yet you also notice the labor it demands. The clock needs winding, calibrating, and oiling. The foliot must be adjusted by a hand that knows how to temper friction. Previously, timekeeping skills were woven through the monastic rule, knowing when to rise by feel, by candle notch, or by bell. Now a new craft appears, the clock keeper, a specialist whose knowledge is technical rather than devotional. In some houses, monks learned this craft. In others, the monastery hired lay artisans to maintain the mechanism. A new kind of competence and a new kind of dependence are born. Historians still argue whether mechanical clocks democratized time or concentrated control. Some scholars emphasize how public striking clocks allowed townspeople, not just monks, to synchronize labor and commerce, seeding the later discipline that would shape markets and factories. Others argue the opposite. The clocks simply reflected an existing social need for coordination in increasingly complex communities. The truth probably sits between. Metallic time responded to economic change, even as it helped produce new rhythms of work. You wander closer to the clock face, if there is one yet, seeing the first attempts at dials, crude hour markers hand-painted on wood. Winds howl through cracked stone, and the clock's sound cuts through it. A slow, relentless tick like the measured approach of winter. Monks test it against candles, setting wax notches, and seeing if the iron heart keeps better time. In many cases, it does. Where a gust might ruin a taper, the clock continues to count, untroubled by breath. But the arrival of iron time also revives anxieties about standardization. Where candles gave communities a pliable sense of hours, longer in summer, shorter in winter, mechanical clocks push toward constant hours, severing time from natural rhythms. For agrarian societies, such a shift feels odd. The harvest does not follow a clock's minute hand. Yet for commerce and centralized worship, regularity wins. This tension underpins a larger scholarly debate. Did mechanical time help accelerate economic change by enforcing punctuality, or did it merely adapt to shifts already underway? You find, too, that installing the new iron heart becomes a small rite. The community gathers, a prayer is said for weights and gears, and the artisan is thanked with bread. Technology arrives with ceremony. Novices learn to wind the mechanism. The steward keeps a modest maintenance ledger of oilings and adjustments. Skilled lay craftsmen become welcomed guests. The clockmaker's knotty hands fix gears and bring tales of civic towers that strike hours for markets and courts. The monastery becomes a node in a wider technical network. Ironwork flows between cloister and town. Still, resistance surfaces. Older brothers say the tick corrals attention, nudging prayer toward punctuality instead of presence. Younger monks praise the clarity. No more arguments about when Vespers begins. Historians still argue whether mechanical clocks liberated communities by coordinating labor or whether they seeded the later discipline of factories, standardizing time in service of efficiency. Often, candle and clock coexist. In many houses, the clock rings the canonical hours, while marked tapers continue to pace personal vigils. There's no neat victory of iron over wax, rather a layering. Metal gives outward coordination. Wax preserves inward intimacy. Between gear and flame, the monastery invents a new grammar of time, both public and personal, both measured and felt. The monastery's bells now ring not only from candle-guided vigil, but also from the insistent beat of gears in the tower. Yet, down in the scriptorium, you still see brothers trimming tapers and marking them with quiet precision. There's no sense of sudden abandonment, more a layering, like parchment written over and scraped, time recorded twice. Once by flame, once by iron. Mainstream historical fact. Even after mechanical clocks spread in the late Middle Ages, candle clocks continued in use well into the 15th and 16th centuries, especially in households and smaller religious communities. They remained cheaper, more portable, and more intimate than massive gear-driven machines. A candle in your cell still gave you privacy in prayer that no tower bell could provide. You picture a monk comparing both systems at once. A marked candle notched with hours sits beside a sandglass, and faintly above, the clatter of the new clock echoes down stone walls. He tests them against each other, scribbling tiny notes. When the wax reaches its first notch, does the bell ring? Does the sand slip in unison with the iron tick? Sometimes they agree. Sometimes, maddeningly, they don't. And so debate stirs. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one manuscript margin, a monk doodled a little race, candle versus hourglass. He drew flames chasing grains of sand, as though time itself were two competitors forever outpacing each other. The drawing suggests more than idle play. It hints at a fascination with overlapping systems, each claiming accuracy, none truly perfect. Historians still argue about which technology monks trusted most during the transition. Some argue candles endured primarily because they were cheap, while others stress the spiritual intimacy of wax. That flame carried symbolism gears could not. The evidence is scattered, and the truth may be both. Cost and comfort kept candles alive alongside iron for generations. You imagine lying awake, listening to the distant thunk of the clock's foliate while your candle flickers. Which sound seems more trustworthy? The machine's steady beat feels impersonal, relentless. The flame, though unstable, feels human, fragile, alive. For prayer, maybe you prefer that fragility. For labor, perhaps the machine. So both remain awkward partners in the monastery's rhythm. Even lay visitors notice the contrast. Travelers recall stepping from the candlelit infirmary into the courtyard and hearing the new tower strike, two parallel worlds of time coexisting. One measured softly in glow, the other loudly in clang. Which one you heed depends on whether you are sick in bed or summoned to work in the fields. And in practice, monks learn to juggle them. A vigil might begin with a candle, end with a bell. Work might be scheduled by iron, prayer by flame. The monastery became a layered orchestra of timekeepers, all slightly out of tune, yet somehow guiding life forward. So you realize, candle clocks didn't vanish, they adapted, holding their place beside sand and gear. For centuries more, monks still bent over dripping wax, watching time pass by fire even as iron ticked above them. Flame and machine together define the late medieval sense of time, personal and public, fragile and unyielding. You wander outside into the monastery's garden at twilight, the scents of rosemary, thyme, and wet earth thick in the air. The bell has just tolled, and the last rays of sun fall across rows of herbs that will later feed the infirmary or flavor the evening broth. Candles still burn inside, marking the fading day, and you realize that flame, now entwined with mechanical clocks, continues to dictate the pace of life even beyond walls. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval gardens were meticulously timed spaces. Monks planted, watered, and harvested according to canonical hours, often guided by the same candle clocks that structured prayer and work. Light, natural and artificial, was integral for determining not only when to begin labor, but also when plants had reached medicinal potency. You stoop to smell a bloom of lavender, noticing how the soft glow of a nearby candle reflects faintly on dew-soaked leaves. Monks sometimes carried tiny tapers into the garden during late evening harvests, especially in winter months, to guide careful hands while preserving silence. The flame is a quiet companion, marking intervals, signaling the end of a row, the moment to pause and rest. Here's a quirky detail. Some gardens had candle rings, small circles of waxed clay embedded along paths, each inscribed with notches. A monk could place a tiny candle in each ring and time various tasks: weeding, watering, pruning. It's almost like a medieval interval timer, and while it seems whimsical today, it was intensely practical for labor allocation and meditative pacing. Historians still debate how widespread such devices were. Some suggest they were a rare innovation of Northern European abbeys with long winter nights. Others believe similar systems may have been used informally, leaving few traces. Either way, it shows the ingenuity of monastic communities in integrating timekeeping into daily life. The interplay between candle and clock here is subtle. Mechanical clocks provide the audible cues that structure the overall day. But inside each gardener's hands, the candle dictates minute movements, the pace of bending, planting, and harvesting. Wax gives a personal rhythm that iron cannot provide. You watch a monk pause, his taper lowered, listening to the wind through rosemary, timing his next action by the slow drip of molten wax. Even nature itself seems to respond. A moth flutters toward the glow, a hedgehog scurries into shadow. These small living things, entirely indifferent to bells or gears, intersect with the human system in surprising ways. The candle mediates, enough light to work, yet soft enough not to frighten creatures away. And the spiritual dimension remains. Many monks still bless the first harvest of the season, holding candles aloft as prayers rise. Light, wax, and prayer intertwine, reminding you that even practical labor is imbued with devotion. The candle marks time, ensures work is complete, and carries intention into the act itself. You also notice the limits. A sudden gust extinguishes a taper. The monk must relight, restarting the interval. Here, as elsewhere, the candle is a reminder of human imperfection and environmental unpredictability. Mechanical clocks cannot account for wind, rain, or sudden darkness, but wax adapts, flickers, survives, falters. It is vulnerable, yet flexible, a teaching in resilience. And so, in the garden, you perceive a larger truth. Whether tending herbs, copying manuscripts, or caring for the sick, monks rely on multiple systems to measure existence. Candles, clocks, sun, and instinct work together. Each layer of timekeeping reinforces the others, and yet each is distinct, emphasizing a different aspect of life: prayer, labor, contemplation, care. By the time you leave the garden and step back inside the cloister, you feel the rhythm of centuries beneath your feet. Candles burn low, mechanical clocks continue their precise clatter, and nature exhales around stone walls. Time, in all its forms, moves steadily forward, and you realize that human attention, guided by flame or gear, is what gives it shape. You find yourself wandering into the dormitory as night deepens, the long hall lined with narrow sleeping niches. Candles, small and steady, glow along the edges of beds, marking time for the last prayers, the final personal reflections, and the moments before sleep. Even here, long after mechanical clocks have asserted their authority, wax remains intimate, personal, a companion to consciousness. Mainstream historical fact. Monastic dormitories often maintained individual candle lighting to help monks regulate private vigils, nighttime prayers, and silent meditation before retiring. Unlike the communal bell, which announces time externally, candles provide internal pacing, allowing each monk to measure his own spiritual journey. You notice the soft, almost imperceptible sounds. The hiss of a candle wick, the creak of straw mattresses as monks adjust themselves, the distant echo of the night bell marking canonical hours. The dormitory is hushed, yet alive, each flame a tiny heartbeat in a long hall of quiet devotion. Candles guide both wakefulness and sleep, shaping attention without demanding it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some monasteries had whisper candles, thin tapers with exceptionally slow burn times, meant to accompany monks through entire vigils. Their smoke was scented, sometimes with lavender or rosemary, adding a faint, calming aroma. Imagine drifting off to the smell of a slowly burning herb, counting time with wax rather than worry. Historians still argue how standardized candle use really was. Some believe every dormitory had precise notched tapers for individual pacing. Others argue that most monks simply lit a candle and relied on personal judgment, letting flame guide them more intuitively. Evidence from surviving monastery inventories is incomplete, so the debate persists. Candles also acted as guides through personal devotion. A monk might light a taper at the start of Compline and allow it to burn while reciting psalms, meditating, or journaling. The wax dictated interval without requiring anyone else to enforce the schedule. The intimate glow reinforces the second-person experience. Time here is both universal and profoundly personal. The dormitory also hosts minor rituals. One brother uses his candle to mark the end of study. Another lights it to signal readiness for confession in the morning. Each flame represents attention, discipline, and subtle authority over oneself. Even in sleep, the taper can be trusted to mark passing hours. You notice the fragility of this system. A candle guttering or breaking forces adaptation. A brother may relight it, shift his schedule, or accept uncertainty. Wax teaches patience and attentiveness. In contrast, mechanical clocks, while relentless and precise, offer no flexibility. Iron demands obedience, while flame permits dialogue. And so, in these quiet hours, you see why monks clung to candle clocks even as gears dominated towers. Flame is personal, intimate, adaptable. It allows the individual to measure existence in his own rhythm while still participating in communal time. It is tactile, meditative, and in a way, alive, dying gradually, leaving behind a stub that reminds you of what has passed. As you move through the dormitory, you feel that the monks' long tradition of counting time with candles has left a subtle legacy. An understanding that human life cannot be fully imposed by machinery or standardized measurement. Wax teaches mindfulness, the beauty of transience, and the quiet discipline of attending to the present. You step into the final hours of the night, wandering through the cloister as shadows stretch and bend with the faint glow of taper flames. Every corridor seems alive with whispered history, the soft hiss of melting wax, and the rhythmic echo of distant bells. You realize that candle clocks, once simple tools, have become companions, teachers, and witnesses, marking the monastery's life in both visible and invisible ways. Mainstream historical fact. By the late medieval period, candles were a ubiquitous tool for measuring time across Europe, not just in monasteries but also in households, workshops, and smaller religious communities. They provided a portable, adaptable, and relatively accurate method for dividing the day, complementing bells and later mechanical clocks. Here's the quirky detail. Some abbeys practiced memory burning with candles. Monks would carve the names of patrons, deceased brothers, or significant events into the wax, so that as the candle burned down, memory and measurement unfolded simultaneously. The melting wax became a tangible narrative, an intimate chronicle of devotion intertwined with hours. Historians still debate the symbolic versus practical functions of such practices. Were these carvings intended as devotional reminders, or were they more whimsical expressions of individuality in an otherwise regimented routine? Evidence is tantalizing but fragmentary, leaving interpretation open. You walk past the refectory, where echoes of meals linger faintly in the stone. The infirmary's soft glow and gentle hissing wax still mark long nights of care. The scriptorium is silent, but you imagine the ghosts of quills and ink, each manuscript shaped by measured flames. Even the garden waits, dew settling quietly over herbs once timed by candle intervals. Across all these spaces, wax has served as teacher, companion, and arbiter of rhythm. Candles remind you that time was once personal, tactile, and intimate. Unlike bells, which demanded communal obedience, or mechanical clocks, which imposed abstract precision, wax offered a gentle partnership. It required attention, encouraged patience, and recorded hours with visible decay, a slow, beautiful surrender to impermanence. The monastery's layered timekeeping, bells, candles, sandglasses, and eventually gears, reveals a sophisticated understanding of human experience. Monks learned to integrate multiple systems, balancing communal obligations with private devotion, labor with reflection. You see the care in their ordering, the creativity in their adaptations, and the subtle joy in watching wax drip steadily, marking hours with quiet, luminous dignity. And so, as the night deepens, you feel the monastery breathe around you, measured by flame, sound, and the delicate echo of human attention. Candle clocks are no longer mere tools. They are history itself, flickering witness to centuries of devotion, work, care, and reflection. You understand why monks counted time this way, and perhaps why we still find their rhythms comforting, even now. The night settles, stretching long and soft, and you feel yourself letting go of rigid hours, allowing the gentle glow of wax and the distant resonance of bells to guide you. Time here is no longer a command or an obligation. It is a quiet companion, bending and flowing with your awareness, as if every drip of molten wax carries centuries of human breath, prayer, and toil. You notice the hush of the cloister around you, the faint scent of herbs, beeswax, and parchment lingering in the air, weaving comfort into the cool stone. Breathe in slowly. The memory of taper flames, soft and steady, reminds you that not all measurement demands urgency. There is patience in observing a wick shrink, a rhythm in letting an hour pass unnoticed, a gentle grace in marking time without pressure. You are carried along by centuries of monastic life, tracing the quiet ingenuity that allowed monks to blend devotion, work, and reflection into every moment. Perhaps you imagine the gardens, still and fragrant at dawn, or the infirmary where candles protected both life and care. You can hear the faint echo of gears, reminding you that progress moves alongside tradition, but that neither supplants the delicate art of noticing the present. Wax teaches presence, resilience, and mindfulness. Iron teaches coordination, order, and reach. Together, they form a cadence that feels both human and eternal. Let your eyes close now if you wish. Picture those soft flames, the slow drip, the measured glow, and the peace it brings. Let it calm your mind, slow your pulse, and draw you toward the gentle rhythm of sleep. Rest in the knowledge that even across centuries, human attention, care, and devotion have been shaped and marked by simple, humble candles.